Welcome to our Books Summary channel, Explore Books.
Today, we will get a summary of another new book.
An Era of Darkness, The British Empire in India is a book written by Shashi Tharoor, a prominent Indian politician, and former United Nations Under-Secretary General. The book is an authoritative critique of British colonial rule in India, and it examines the impact of British imperialism on the Indian subcontinent. Tharoor argues that British colonialism was responsible for a host of economic, political, and social ills that continue to plague India today. The book provides a detailed and comprehensive account of the British Empire's exploitation of India, highlighting the destructive impact of British policies on the Indian economy, society, and culture. Chapter 1 of An Era of Darkness is titled The Looting of India, and it sets the stage for the rest of the book by examining the economic impact of British colonialism on India. Shashi Tharoor argues that British colonialism was characterized by a systematic policy of economic exploitation, which resulted in the impoverishment of India and the enrichment of Britain. Tharoor begins the chapter by providing an overview of India's economic history prior to British colonialism. He notes that India was a prosperous and wealthy country prior to British rule, with a sophisticated and diverse economy that produced a wide range of goods and services for both domestic and international markets. Tharoor argues that British colonialism fundamentally altered India's economic structures and that the impact of this change is still being felt today. One of the key themes of this chapter is the idea of the economic drain. Tharoor argues that British colonialism was characterized by a system of economic exploitation, in which India was forced to serve as a source of raw materials and a market for British goods. He notes that India was systematically drained of its wealth and that this wealth was used to finance the development of Britain's own economy. Tharoor also discusses the impact of British economic policies on India's domestic industries. He notes that British colonialism had a devastating impact on India's domestic industries, as British policies were designed to systematically undermine India's traditional economic structures and force India to become a dependent market for British goods. Tharoor argues that this policy of economic exploitation contributed to the impoverishment of India and that it created a deeply unequal relationship between India and Britain. Another important theme in this chapter is the idea of colonial violence. Tharoor notes that British colonialism was characterized by a system of violence and coercion, in which Indian resources were seized and Indian people were subjected to brutal repression in order to maintain British economic and political control. Tharoor argues that this system of violence had a profound impact on India's social and economic structures and that it created a legacy of trauma and inequality that persists to this day. Overall, Chapter 1 provides a detailed and comprehensive analysis of the impact of British colonialism on India's economy. Tharoor's analysis highlights the systematic policy of economic exploitation that characterized British colonialism and the ways in which this policy contributed to the impoverishment of India and the enrichment of Britain. The chapter provides an important insight into the ways in which British colonialism fundamentally altered India's economic structures, and the lasting impact this has had on India's economy and society. Chapter 2 of An Era of Darkness is titled Did the British Give India Political Unity? And it challenges the commonly held belief that the British were responsible for bringing political unity to India. Shashi Tharoor argues that this idea is a myth and that the British actually contributed to the fragmentation of India through their policies of divide and rule. Tharoor begins the chapter by examining the political history of India prior to British colonialism. He notes that India had a long and complex history of political organization, with a wide range of diverse cultures, languages, and religions coexisting in a complex network of alliances and relationships. Tharoor argues that this system of political organization was fundamentally altered by British colonialism and that the impact of this change is still being felt today. One of the key arguments that Tharoor makes in this chapter is that the British used a policy of divide and rule in order to maintain control over India. He notes that the British systematically pitted different groups against each other and that they used religion, language, and caste as tools to create divisions within Indian society. Tharoor argues that this policy of divide and rule had a profound impact on India's political unity and that it contributed to the fragmentation of India. Tharoor also discusses the impact of British policies on India's political structures. He notes that the British introduced a system of centralized control, which was designed to maintain British political dominance over India. Tharoor argues that this system of centralized control was fundamentally at odds with India's traditional political structures and that it contributed to the fragmentation of India. Another important theme in this chapter is the idea of colonial violence. Tharoor notes that British colonialism was characterized by a system of violence and coercion, in which Indian resources were seized and Indian people were subjected to brutal repression in order to maintain British economic and political control. Tharoor argues that this system of violence had a profound impact on India's social and political structures and that it created a legacy of trauma and inequality that persists to this day. Overall, Chapter 2 provides a detailed and comprehensive analysis of the impact of British colonialism on India's political unity. Tharoor's analysis challenges the commonly held belief that the British were responsible for bringing political unity to India and instead argues that they contributed to the fragmentation of India through their policies of divide and rule. The chapter provides an important insight into the ways in which British colonialism fundamentally altered India's political structures, and the lasting impact this has had on India's society and politics. Chapter 3 of An Era of Darkness is titled Democracy, the Press, the Parliamentary System and the Rule of Law, and it examines the British legacy of political institutions in India. Shashi Tharoor argues that the British did not bring democracy, the press, the parliamentary system, and the rule of law to India, but rather that these institutions were already present in India prior to British colonialism. Tharoor begins the chapter by examining the history of democracy in India, noting that India had a long tradition of democratic practices prior to British colonialism. He points to examples of democratic institutions and practices in ancient India, such as the system of village councils and the selection of leaders through democratic processes. Tharoor argues that the British did not introduce democracy to India, but rather they worked to suppress and undermine existing democratic practices. Tharoor then examines the role of the press in India, noting that the Indian press had a long history of independent journalism prior to British colonialism. He argues that the British did not introduce the concept of a free press to India, but rather they worked to suppress independent journalism and control the flow of information. Next, Tharoor examines the parliamentary system in India, noting that India had a long tradition of democratic institutions prior to British colonialism. He argues that the British introduced a system of representative government in India not out of a desire to promote democracy, but rather as a means of maintaining control over India's political structures. Tharoor also notes that the parliamentary system introduced by the British was fundamentally flawed, as it did not represent the diversity of India's population and was dominated by British interests. Finally, Tharoor examines the rule of law in India, noting that India had a long history of legal institutions and practices prior to British colonialism. He argues that the British introduced a legal system in India that was fundamentally at odds with India's existing legal traditions. and that it was designed to maintain British political and economic control over India. Overall, Chapter 3 provides a detailed and nuanced analysis of the British legacy of political institutions in India. Thoreau's analysis challenges the commonly held belief that the British brought democracy, the press, the parliamentary system, and the rule of law to India, and instead argues that these institutions were already present in India prior to British colonialism. The chapter provides important insights into the ways in which British colonialism fundamentally altered India's political structures, and the lasting impact this has had on India's society and politics. Chapter 4 of An Era of Darkness is titled Divide et Impera, a Latin phrase that means divide and rule. In this chapter, Shashi Tharoor explores how the British used a policy of divide and rule to maintain their control over India, and how this policy had a devastating impact on India's society and politics. Tharoor begins the chapter by examining how the British used the policy of divide and rule to maintain their control over India. He notes that the British identified various social, religious, and linguistic differences in India and exploited them to sow division among the Indian people. Tharoor argues that this policy of divide and rule was central to the British colonial project in India and enabled them to maintain control over a vast and diverse population. Tharoor then examines the ways in which this policy of divide and rule had a devastating impact on India's society and politics. He notes that the British exploited existing fault lines in Indian society, exacerbating tensions between different groups and creating new conflicts. Tharoor argues that the policy of divide and rule ultimately led to the partition of India in 1947, a traumatic event that resulted in displacement and violence against millions of people. Tharoor also explores how the policy of divide and rule affected India's economy. He notes that the British imposed economic policies that benefited their own interests, rather than those of the Indian people. Tharoor argues that this economic exploitation was made possible by the policy of divide and rule, which enabled the British to suppress resistance and maintain control over India's economic resources. Finally, Tharoor examines how the policy of divide and rule continues to affect India's society and politics today. He notes that the legacy of this policy can be seen in ongoing conflicts between different religious and ethnic groups, as well as in the political rhetoric used by some politicians to sow division among the Indian people. Overall, Chapter 4 provides a detailed analysis of the policy of divide and rule and its impact on India's society and politics. Tharoor's analysis challenges the commonly held belief that the British colonial project in India was a benign enterprise, and highlights the ways in which British colonialism was a destructive force that had lasting consequences for India. The chapter provides important insights into the ways in which colonialism can be used to sow division and undermine the social and political fabric of society. In Chapter 5 of An Era of Darkness, Shashi Tharoor debunks the myth of enlightened despotism that was used to justify British colonialism in India. This myth posits that while the British may have been despotic in their rule, they were also enlightened and brought progress and development to India. Tharoor argues that this myth is not only false but also dangerous, as it obscures the true nature of British colonialism in India and the harm it inflicted on Indian society and economy. He notes that while the British did bring some technological advancements to India, they did so for their own benefit and not for the betterment of the Indian people. Tharoor also explores how the British used the myth of enlightened despotism to justify their policies of economic exploitation and cultural erasure. He notes that the British justified their economic policies, such as the drain of wealth from India, by claiming that they were investing in India's infrastructure and development. In reality, these policies were designed to benefit the British economy and maintain British control over India's resources. Tharoor also examines how the British attempted to erase Indian culture and history, arguing that the myth of enlightened despotism was used to justify this cultural erasure. He notes that the British viewed Indian culture as inferior and sought to replace it with their own culture and values. Tharoor argues that this cultural erasure was not only harmful to Indian society but also robbed India of its rich cultural heritage. Finally, Tharoor explores how the myth of enlightened despotism continues to be perpetuated today. He notes that many people still believe that British colonialism was a benign and beneficial enterprise, and that this belief is often used to justify continued British influence in India. Overall, Chapter 5 provides a powerful critique of the myth of enlightened despotism and its impact on India. Tharoor's analysis challenges the notion that colonialism can ever be a force for good and highlights the ways in which colonialism can be used to justify economic exploitation and cultural erasure. The chapter underscores the importance of acknowledging the harm inflicted by colonialism and working to undo its lasting legacy. In Chapter 6 of An Era of Darkness, Shashi Tharoor examines the remaining arguments that are sometimes used to justify British colonialism in India. While acknowledging that some people still defend the British Empire and its legacy, Tharoor argues that these arguments are flawed and do not hold up to scrutiny. Tharoor first examines the argument that the British brought law and order to India and that they were needed to keep the country stable and secure. He notes that while the British did establish a legal system in India, this system was often used to enforce colonial control and suppress Indian dissent. Tharoor also highlights how the British frequently used violence and coercion to maintain their rule, including the use of torture and extrajudicial killings. Next, Tharoor looks at the argument that the British brought economic development to India and that they helped to modernize the country. He notes that while the British did introduce some technological advancements to India, such as the railways and telegraph, these were primarily designed to benefit British trade and commerce. Moreover, Tharoor argues that the economic policies of the British were designed to extract wealth from India and to prevent the development of Indian industries. Tharoor also examines the argument that the British brought education to India and that they helped to spread Western ideas and values. While acknowledging that the British did establish some schools and universities in India, Tharoor notes that the education system was primarily designed to produce a class of loyal, English-speaking Indians who could serve as intermediaries between the British and the Indian people. Moreover, Tharoor argues that the British education system helped to erode Indian culture and identity and to replace it with British values and ideas. Finally, Tharoor looks at the argument that the British Empire was a force for global stability and that it helped to prevent conflict and promote peace. He notes that while the British did play a role in some international conflicts, such as World War II, they also contributed to global instability by promoting imperialism and colonialism. Moreover, Tharoor argues that the British Empire was often a source of conflict and violence within India, as different communities were pitted against each other and oppressed by British rule. Overall, Chapter 6 provides a thorough and compelling critique of the remaining arguments used to justify British colonialism in India. Tharoor's analysis challenges the notion that colonialism can ever be a force for good and highlights the ways in which colonialism can be used to justify violence, exploitation, and oppression. The chapter underscores the importance of understanding the true nature of British colonialism in India and working to undo its lasting legacy. Chapter 7, Their Balance Sheet, a coda, serves as a conclusion to the book An Era of Darkness, The British Empire in India by Shashi Tharoor. The author discusses the legacy of British rule in India, and he examines the balance sheet of the empire's impact on the country. Tharoor begins by acknowledging that some British apologists argue that the British Empire's overall impact on India was positive. They argue that the British brought modernity, order, democracy, and the rule of law to India. They also point out that the British left behind institutions such as the railways, postal system, and civil service that continue to function in India today. However, Thoreau counters these arguments by pointing out that India had a rich and diverse civilization with its systems of governance, art, literature, and trade before British rule. He argues that the British dismantled these systems and replaced them with their own to extract resources from the country. The author states that the British used India as a source of revenue to fund their industrial revolution and to build their empire. Thoreau also argues that the British damaged the Indian economy, leading to the impoverishment of millions of people. He points out that India's share of the global GDP fell from 24% to 4% during British rule. The British drained India's wealth to fund their wars, and they imposed unfair trade policies that destroyed India's industries. India's poverty and economic underdevelopment today can be traced back to the British era. Thoreau also debunks the myth that the British brought democracy and the rule of law to India. He points out that the British only introduced limited representative democracy, and it was only available to the elite. The vast majority of Indians did not have the right to vote until after independence. Thoreau also points out that British rule was arbitrary and often violent. The British government could imprison Indians without trial, and there was no guarantee of the rule of law. In conclusion, Thoreau argues that the British Empire's impact on India was overwhelmingly negative. The British exploited India's resources, damaged its economy, and dismantled its civilization. While the British left behind some institutions, these institutions were not designed to benefit India but rather to serve the interests of the British Empire. Thoreau argues that India's problems today can be traced back to the British era, and the country is still grappling with the legacy of British colonialism. Chapter 8 of Shashi Thoreau's book An Era of Darkness is titled The Messy Afterlife of Colonialism. In this chapter, Thoreau examines the aftermath of British colonialism in India and the challenges that the country faced in the years following independence. Thoreau begins the chapter by discussing the challenges that India faced after gaining independence from British rule. He notes that India was left with a divided society, an underdeveloped economy, and a legacy of British-imposed institutions that were not always suited to Indian needs. Thoreau argues that the task of building a new India was made all the more difficult by the fact that the British had left the country with a cultural and psychological dislocation. Thoreau then goes on to discuss some of the specific challenges that India faced after independence. One of the most significant of these was the problem of religious conflict. Thoreau notes that the British had left India with a legacy of communalism, which pitted different religious and ethnic groups against one another. This legacy was compounded by the fact that the British had partitioned India at the time of independence, creating two separate countries, India and Pakistan, along religious lines. Thoreau also discusses the challenges that India faced in terms of economic development. He notes that the British had left India with an economy that was heavily dependent on agriculture and raw material exports, and that India had to struggle to build up its industrial base in the years following independence. Thoreau argues that this task was made more difficult by the fact that the British had deliberately undermined India's economic development during colonial rule, by forcing India to export raw materials rather than encouraging the development of local industries. Thoreau also examines the legacy of British-imposed institutions in India, such as the civil service, the judiciary, and the education system. He argues that many of these institutions were designed to serve British interests rather than Indian needs, and that they often perpetuated colonial attitudes and practices even after independence. Thoreau notes that some Indian leaders, such as Jawaharlal Nehru, recognized the need to reform these institutions in order to make them more responsive to Indian needs. However, he also notes that this task was often difficult and contentious, and that many of these institutions remain in place today. despite their problematic origins. Finally, Thoreau discusses some of the broader implications of British colonialism for India and the world as a whole. He argues that colonialism had a profound impact on the psyche of colonized peoples and that its legacy continues to shape the world today. Thoreau notes that many of the problems that India faced after independence, such as religious conflict and economic underdevelopment, were not unique to India, but were shared by other colonized countries as well. In conclusion, Chapter 8 of An Era of Darkness provides a thoughtful and nuanced examination of the challenges that India faced in the aftermath of British colonialism. Thoreau's analysis highlights the complex legacy of colonialism and the difficulties that newly independent countries face in trying to build a new society in the wake of colonial rule. Overall, this chapter serves as a powerful reminder of the long-lasting impact of colonialism on the world, and the ongoing struggle for post-colonial societies to create a better future for themselves.
Thank you for visiting our channel, Explore Books. We hope you found the summary informative and helpful. Please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more updates. Happy reading!